Welcome on board, Chosen One. You survived something most people never even see coming, let alone walk out of in one piece. And the funniest part is how confused they still are about how you did it. They called it love. You called it survival. And now that you're standing on the other side of it, breathing, healed, glowing in a way that has absolutely nothing to do with them, they're still trying to figure out what happened. Remember when they said you were too sensitive? When they said you were imagining things? When they twisted every single memory until you couldn't tell what was real anymore? Look at you now. The same person who made you question your own name can't even look you in the eye. The same voice that used to control every room you walked into goes quiet the second your name comes up. They spent years convincing you that you were the problem, and now they're the ones sitting in the wreckage of a story that finally caught up to them. And before we keep going, do a small thing to pay this message back. Hit the like button and subscribe so this energy keeps spreading to every soul who needs to hear it today. Anyway, let's talk about the part nobody wants to admit out loud. What happened to you wasn't a relationship that just didn't work out. It was a war you didn't sign up for, fought against someone who studied exactly where you were softest and aimed for it, over and over, until softness started to feel dangerous. And somehow, against every calculation they made about you, you got out. Not unscathed. Not unchanged. But out, alive, and eventually, stronger than the version of you they thought they'd erased. There's a certain silence that follows a storm like that, and you're standing right in the middle of it now. It's the eerie, powerful calm where the air feels different, where even the people who still don't fully understand what happened to you can't deny something and you shifted. They don't know if they should ask you about it, avoid the subject entirely, or pretend they always knew you'd be fine. Their confusion is almost funny at this point. And here's the part that hits harder than anything they ever said to break you down. You didn't just survive them. You learned something in that fire that most people never learn without going through it themselves. You learned exactly what your own voice sounds like when it's not being edited for someone else's comfort. And that voice, Chosen One, is the thing they'll never be able to take from you again. Before we go any deeper, Chosen One, take a breath. You're not here by accident. You clicked on this because something in you already knows the story is yours. If you feel that pull in your chest right now, drop 777 in the comments to mark the moment you stopped explaining your healing to people who never apologized for the damage. Consider it your signature on this next chapter. Now let's step into this properly. If you're really one of the ones who made it out, you'll feel the weight of what's coming. Let's begin. The mask that finally slipped. Funny how charming they were to everyone else while you were the only one who ever saw what was underneath. You want brutal? Fine. Here's the part that makes the whole thing click into place. They spent the entire beginning of that relationship performing a version of themselves that didn't actually exist. The attention, the intensity, the way they made you feel like you'd finally found someone who truly saw you. That wasn't love. That was reconnaissance. They were studying you, learning exactly what you needed to hear, and feeding it back to you at a pace specifically designed to bypass every instinct that would have normally made you cautious. Here's the sick plot twist you didn't see coming at the time. The version of them you fell for was never real. It was a costume built specifically for you, stitched together from your own hopes and vulnerabilities, worn just long enough to get you invested before the real person underneath started leaking through the seams. And when the mask finally slipped, you didn't imagine it. You weren't being dramatic. You were finally seeing what had been there the entire time, hidden behind a performance so convincing that even you, someone with good instincts, got fooled by it. That's not a flaw in your judgment. That's evidence of how skilled the performance actually was. Let's cut deeper. People who live entirely on manipulation will always misread someone who eventually catches on. They assume you were naive for believing the mask in the first place. What they don't understand is that believing a well-crafted lie isn't naivety. It's basic human trust, the same trust that makes relationships possible in the first place. Your mistake wasn't trusting too easily. Their crime was exploiting exactly that trust on purpose. Here's the fact that eats them alive now. You saw through it eventually, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The mask that worked so well in the beginning became the exact thing that exposed them completely once you learned to recognize the pattern. And now every time they try that same performance on someone new, there's a small, permanent part of your mind that already knows exactly what's coming, because you already survived the original. There's one more layer worth naming here, because it matters for anyone still healing from this exact pattern. The guilt some survivors carry about not seeing through the mask sooner is misplaced entirely. A costume built specifically to bypass your instincts isn't a test you failed. It's evidence of exactly how much effort went into making sure you couldn't see through it in real time. Hindsight clarity was never available to you in the moment, and it was never supposed to be. The silence they called coldness was actually survival. Funny how the moment you stopped over-explaining yourself, they suddenly decided you'd changed for the worse. Here's what they never understood about your silence, because understanding it would have required admitting what they'd done to earn it. Every time you stopped defending yourself, stopped justifying your feelings, stopped trying to make them understand something they had no interest in actually understanding, you weren't becoming cold. You were protecting the last piece of yourself that hadn't been picked apart yet. Think about what it actually costs a person to keep explaining their pain to someone who uses that explanation as ammunition instead of understanding. Every vulnerable thing you shared got filed away, not for empathy, but for leverage, something to bring up later, twisted just enough to make you doubt whether you'd even felt what you thought you felt. Eventually, the silence wasn't cold. It was the only form of self-defense left available to you. Imagine this. You're standing in a room, bleeding, and every time you point to the wound, the person standing across from you insists there's no wound at all, that you're imagining it, that you're too sensitive, that you're making something out of nothing. Eventually you stop pointing. Not because the wound healed. Because pointing to it stopped changing anything except giving them another opportunity to convince you it was never there in the first place. Here's the truth they'll never admit out loud. Your silence wasn't the end of communication. It was the end of you handing them material to use against you. And that shift, from open and explaining to quiet and protected, is exactly the moment they lost their ability to reshape your reality on command. They call it cold now because cold is easier to criticize than survival. But you know the difference, even if they never will. What looked like distance from the outside was actually the exact moment you finally started keeping something for yourself. It's worth being honest about how lonely that particular silence often felt from the inside, even while it was protecting you. Choosing not to explain yourself anymore doesn't feel like strength at the moment. It often just feels like giving up on being understood at all. But that quiet, uncomfortable as it was the exact soil your eventual clarity grew out of. The gaslighting that almost rewired your reality, but didn't, because some part of you refused to let go of the truth even when you couldn't prove it yet. Let's talk about what that actually felt like, because most people who haven't lived it can't fully grasp the depth of it. You'd witness something clearly, something undeniable, and within minutes of naming it out loud, you'd find yourself apologizing for even bringing it up. Not because you were convinced you were wrong. Because the confusion itself became so exhausting that agreeing to their version of events felt easier than continuing to defend a reality they were determined to erase. Here's the mechanism, laid out plainly. Gaslighting doesn't work by convincing you the sky is green when it's obviously blue. It works slowly, one small denial at a time, until you're no longer sure what color anything actually is anymore. Each individual lie feels small enough to dismiss. It's the accumulation that eventually leaves a person standing in the wreckage of their own perception, unsure which memories are real and which ones got quietly rewritten along the way. Imagine this. Someone hands you a mirror every single day and insists the reflection you're seeing isn't accurate, that you need to trust their description of your own face instead of your own eyes. Do that long enough, and even the most grounded person starts to lose confidence in what they're looking at. That's what you survived. Not one lie. A campaign of thousands of small distortions, each one small enough to seem forgivable in isolation, devastating in total. Here's the fact that I should sit with you the longest. You never fully lost yourself, even in the middle of it. Some part of you kept a private record, quiet and stubborn, that refused to accept the rewritten version completely. That part of you is exactly what eventually got you out, because it never stopped whispering that something was wrong, even during the years you couldn't yet prove it. There's something worth naming plainly about that stubborn internal record you managed to keep, even during the years you couldn't fully trust it yet. That quiet resistance wasn't naivety refusing to accept reality. It was your own nervous system, underneath all the confusion, still quietly insisting that your perception mattered, even when every external voice was telling you otherwise. The smear campaign they ran before you even left, quietly planting doubt about your character to everyone around you, just in case you ever found the strength to walk away. Here's the part that reveals exactly how calculated the whole thing was. Long before you ever considered leaving, they were already telling a carefully constructed story to friends, family, mutual acquaintances, anyone who might one day hear your side and need to be inoculated against believing it. You were being painted as unstable, dramatic, difficult, ungrateful, long before you ever said a single word in your own defense. Think about how deliberate that timing actually is. It's not paranoia after the fact. It's preemptive damage control, laid out in advance by someone who already knew, on some level, that their behavior wouldn't survive an honest telling. If they truly believed their own actions were reasonable, there would be no need to prepare an army of doubters in advance. The smear campaign itself is a confession, whether they ever intended it to be read that way or not. Imagine this. A defendant hiring a jury before the crime has even been committed, carefully selecting people predisposed to disbelieve the eventual victim. That's exactly what happened, quietly, in conversations you weren't part of, opinions being shaped about you before you ever had the chance to shape them yourself. Here's the fact that should replace any shame you might still carry about this. Their preparation proves they knew. You don't prepare a defense for a crime you don't believe you're committing. Every whisper campaign, every carefully placed doubt, every preemptive character assassination was evidence of guilt dressed up as concern. And now, slowly, as the full picture eventually surfaces, that carefully built story is exactly what's starting to unravel. It's worth sitting with how much energy it must have taken them to maintain that preemptive narrative, long before it was ever needed. That kind of ongoing effort doesn't happen by accident. It happens because some part of them always knew the truth wouldn't survive contact with an honest audience, and they were determined to control the narrative before you ever got the chance to. The trauma bond they called loyalty, the invisible chain built from cycles of cruelty and sudden kindness that kept you convinced leaving would somehow be the betrayal, not staying. Here's what nobody explains clearly enough about this particular kind of bond. It isn't built from consistent affection. It's built from unpredictability, a cycle of devastating cruelty followed by intense, overwhelming tenderness, repeated just often enough to create a chemical dependency on the relief of the good moments. Your nervous system wasn't confused. It was responding exactly the way trauma bonds are designed to make it respond. Think about what that cycle actually does to a person over time. Each cruel episode creates real, legitimate fear and pain. Each reconciliation afterward creates real, legitimate relief and hope. The brain, desperate for stability, starts clinging to the reconciliation phase as evidence that the relationship is fundamentally good, even while the pattern keeps repeating. You weren't weak for staying through that cycle. You were responding to a psychological mechanism specifically engineered, whether consciously or not, to keep you hooked. Imagine this. Someone repeatedly pulls a rug out from under you, and then, just as you hit the ground, catches you gently and tells you how much they love you. Over time, the catching starts to feel like proof of love, even though the falling never would have happened without them pulling the rug in the first place. That's the mechanism. That's what kept you there longer than logic alone would have allowed. Here's the truth that finally breaks the spell once it's named clearly. What you called loyalty was actually a survival response to manufactured instability. You weren't choosing them over and over out of weakness. You were responding to a system deliberately built to make leaving feel more dangerous than staying, right up until the moment you finally found the strength to prove that theory wrong. There's a specific kind of grief worth acknowledging here, the grief of realizing your own body and brain were responding exactly the way trauma bonds are designed to make anyone respond, regardless of intelligence or self-awareness. That grief isn't a sign of weakness. It's simply the honest cost of surviving something engineered specifically to be hard to survive. The moment you stopped begging to be understood, and started building a life where understanding from them stopped being a requirement for your own peace. Here's the shift that changed everything, quiet and unannounced, the exact moment your healing actually began. For so long, some part of you kept hoping that if you just explained yourself clearly enough, honestly enough, patiently enough, they would finally see you accurately. That hope kept you tethered to a conversation that was never actually designed to reach resolution. Think about what it takes to finally release that hope completely. It's not giving up. It's recognizing that the person you're trying to reach was never actually listening in the first place, that every explanation you offered was being filtered through a lens specifically designed to distort it. Understanding was never actually on the table. You were negotiating with someone who had no intention of ever agreeing to see you clearly. Imagine this. Spending years knocking on a locked door, convinced that the right combination of words would finally get it to open, never realizing there was never anyone standing on the other side willing to let you in regardless of what you said. The moment you finally stopped knocking wasn't defeat. It was the first moment you started walking toward doors that were actually built to open. Here's the fact that finally sets you free once you accept it fully. Their understanding was never actually necessary for your healing to begin. You'd been treating it as a prerequisite, waiting for permission that was never coming, when the entire time, your own clarity about what happened was already enough. You didn't need them to agree with your story for your story to be true. It's worth naming how strange that particular kind of freedom feels at first, the freedom of no longer needing someone else's agreement to validate your own memory. For so long their acknowledgement felt like the missing piece. Realizing it was never actually necessary can feel disorienting before it feels liberating, but it always eventually feels liberating. The new supply they needed the moment you woke up, because once you stopped playing your assigned role, the entire performance needed a new audience to keep functioning. Here's what happens the moment someone in that dynamic finally starts seeing clearly. The relationship depends on a very specific kind of participation, a willingness to keep absorbing blame, keep offering second chances, keep believing the next promise will be different. The moment that participation stops, even partially, the entire system starts to malfunction, because it was never built to survive contact with clarity. Think about how quickly a replacement tends to appear once that shift happens. That's not a coincidence. It's a necessity. Someone who thrives on a particular dynamic doesn't simply stop needing that dynamic once one source dries up. They go looking for a new one, often before the old one has even fully ended, because the alternative, sitting with the consequences of their own behavior without a fresh audience to distract from it, is intolerable to them. Imagine this. A performer who can only exist on stage suddenly losing their audience mid-show. They don't stop performing. They simply look for the next room willing to watch. That's the pattern, repeating itself with different names attached, long before you ever fully processed what had happened to you. Here's the fact that should replace any lingering guilt about being replaced so quickly. It was never about you specifically. It was about the role you were filling, and the moment you stopped filling it convincingly, the search for a replacement began immediately, not because anyone new was special, but because the machine needed fuel, and you'd finally stopped being willing to supply it. There's a particular kind of clarity available once you stop taking that replacement personally. It was never a competition you lost. It was simply evidence that the entire dynamic depended on having someone, anyone, willing to keep absorbing the same pattern. You stopped being willing, and the search moved elsewhere, which says everything about the mechanism and nothing about your worth. The silent treatment that became your peace, the exact weapon they used to punish you, eventually transforming into the quiet you'd been needing the entire time. Here's the irony that took time to fully appreciate. For so long, their silence was designed as punishment, a deliberate withdrawal meant to destabilize you, to make you scramble for their approval, to remind you how easily they could disappear if you didn't fall back in line. It worked, for a while, because the fear of losing their attention outweighed the discomfort of walking on eggshells to keep it. Think about what happened once that dynamic finally broke. The silence that used to terrify you started, slowly, to feel like relief instead. Not because you stopped caring entirely, but because you finally recognized how much energy had been consumed by constantly managing their moods, predicting their reactions, adjusting yourself to avoid triggering another withdrawal. Once that management stopped being your responsibility, the quiet that followed felt less like punishment and more like the first real breath you'd taken in years. Imagine this. Someone spending years conditioned to flinch at silence, only to discover, once removed from the source of that conditioning, that silence in a healthy life actually feels like peace instead of threat. That recalibration doesn't happen overnight, but it happens, and once it does, it's permanent. Here's the fact that closes this chapter completely. The weapon they used to control you eventually became the exact thing that set you free. Their silence used to mean punishment. Now, on your terms, in your own life, silence simply means rest. It's worth naming how long that recalibration actually takes for most people who've lived through this. Silence doesn't stop feeling dangerous overnight just because the danger is gone. But every day it continues to feel more like rest and less like threat is proof that your nervous system is slowly, patiently, learning the difference between the past and the actual safety of your present. The image they performed for everyone else, the version of them that made you look unstable to people who only ever saw the curated highlight reel. Here's the part that stung the most while you were living through it. In private, you were dealing with someone unpredictable, cruel, manipulative, exhausting in ways nobody outside the relationship could fully understand. In public, that same person was charming, attentive, generous with compliments, seemingly the picture of a devoted partner. And every time you tried to describe what actually happened behind closed doors, you were met with disbelief, because the public performance was simply too convincing. Think about how deliberately calculated that gap actually is. It's not an accident that someone capable of cruelty in private can be so consistently charming in public. That contrast is often the entire strategy, because it ensures that if you ever try to speak up, you'll sound unreliable compared to the polished, likable version everyone else has been shown. Imagine this. Two completely different stages, one built for a private audience of one, designed for control, and one built for a public audience of many, designed for admiration. You were the only person who ever saw both stages simultaneously, which made you sound unbelievable every time you tried to describe the contradiction to someone who had only ever witnessed the second one. Here's the fact that eventually clears your name completely, even if it takes time. Performances eventually crack under enough scrutiny. The version they showed everyone else was never sustainable forever, and slowly, as more people encounter the private version you already knew intimately, the gap between the two stages becomes impossible to keep hidden. There's a specific kind of exhaustion worth acknowledging here, the exhaustion of being disbelieved specifically because the other performance was so convincing. That disbelief was never a reflection of how credible your account actually was. It was a reflection of how skilled the performance had become, refined over time specifically for public consumption. The no contact that broke their control, the single boundary they never expected you to actually hold, because every previous attempt had eventually cracked under enough pressure. Here's what most people misunderstand about karma when it comes to someone like this. It rarely arrives as a lightning bolt. It arrives slowly, patiently, the same patterns that once worked on you, eventually failing on someone with better instincts, or worse timing for them, someone who catches on faster than you did. Every relationship after you becomes a little riskier for them, because the pool of people willing to tolerate that pattern keeps shrinking every time someone escapes and starts warning others. Think about what it actually means to live a life built entirely on performance and manipulation. Every connection has to be managed, every image maintained, every crack hidden before someone notices. That's not freedom. That's exhausting, permanent maintenance, and eventually, inevitably, the cracks show through to someone paying closer attention than you were allowed to at the beginning. Imagine this. A structure built without a real foundation, propped up entirely by performance and control, eventually meeting whether it simply wasn't built to withstand. You don't need to imagine their downfall in detail. You just need to understand that anything built that unstably was never going to hold indefinitely, with or without your help. Here's the fact that lets you finally stop watching for it. You don't need to witness their consequences personally for those consequences to be real. Karma doesn't require your audience to function. It just requires time, and time, unlike you, was never something they could manipulate. The person you became after the storm, quieter in some ways, louder in the ways that actually matter, finally speaking in a voice that belongs entirely to you. Here's the truth that closes every chapter that came before it. You didn't just survive what happened. You built an entirely new relationship with yourself in the wreckage of what used to be your entire identity. The person who eventually walked away learned to trust their own perception again, slowly, painfully, but completely. That trust, once rebuilt, doesn't easily break the same way twice. Think about everything you now carry that you didn't have before any of this started. A radar for manipulation most people never develop until forced to. A boundary system built from necessity instead of theory. A quiet, unshakable confidence in your own memory of events, even when nobody else was there to confirm it. None of that existed in you the same way before this happened. All of it exists permanently now. Imagine this one final time. Someone walking out of a fire they never chose to enter, carrying nothing that survived except themselves, and somehow, against every expectation, that turns out to be more than enough. That's exactly who you are right now, standing here, still burning slightly at the edges, but fully, undeniably intact. Here's the fact that ends this story exactly where it needed to end. They didn't create the person you've become. They simply failed to prevent it. Every quality that makes you unbreakable now was built despite their best efforts, not because of them, and that distinction, chosen one, is the entire difference between what they wanted and what actually happened.